And as a small fee of that, you have to bear with me in this presentation. Yeah. This is the okay.
Yeah, you have to turn it on.
Turn it off. Yeah, great. All right. So, yeah, I think I thought it will be an opportunity for me to discuss something which is of interest to me, at least. I'm not sure if you have ever considered a very complex subject like economics from a religious point of view. Have anyone considered that actually, like from a religion point of view, the subject of economics?
I've
You have?
considered religion from an economics point of view.
You have?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's a helpful start. I mean, of course, the premise is that there could be some relationship between, let's say, the religion, our faith, and a subject like economics, which is about resources, our wants and desires, pretty much in this in this part of the world, according to our faith. So this is the premise, obviously, and then further explanation is that this is not a general presentation on religion and economics. This is on the Islamic economics. This is a subject which I'm relatively more familiar with, and I don't know if any of you have studied anything about Islamic economics or Islamic finance, but it seems to be growing quite well as industry, like Islamic finance, Islamic banking, these Islamic bonds, leasing operations, sukuk, they are called Islamic bonds. So they operate very much in a conventional market. The main difference is the underlying assets have to be, first of all, legitimate in terms of the Sharia principles, but also physical assets. So I read yesterday, for instance, the government of Pakistan was issuing a bond by using the land of Karachi airport as collateral. So they didn't have enough money, so they have to raise money, and so they have been using physical assets as collateral, and then going to Middle East countries to the investors who would then have an appeal for this Islamic notion of the investments. But that's very technical, Islamic finance, Islamic investments, and Islamic banking. Today I am going to talk about some principles about as far as Islam and economics is concerned, and hopefully have some discussion, reflections. Carmelo and I have been talking about this subject from a comparative religion point of view. Maybe later today Carmelo would be able to share more on that. So yeah, with these qualifications, I come back to this subject. Now, first of all, this is a quote from a book which was published about 3 years ago. It's an interesting book of economic history, I would say. We heard a lot about economic history today. Benedict Kohler, he is originally German, but now based in UK. He was a banker, but then he has devoted his intellectual efforts to studying the Islamic economic history, I would say, as in civilization history, also in terms of the institutions, how the Islamic civilization contributed towards development of trade, international trade, venture capital, and other principles such as property rights and voluntary trade. And so this work is not this work is not theological in nature. It's more historical, and I think but kind of this work is needed more because there is a lot of theological work which is existing in this subject. But he believes that in the early part of the Islamic history, actually Muslims were able to introduce a framework of economy which helped in promotion of prosperity in large parts of the world.
Well, just a clarification point. When you say this work is not on religion but more historical, would that be the equivalent of a difference between a prescriptive or normative versus a description? So
Yeah.
the religion one, you would
Yeah.
see it like as necessarily normative.
Yeah.
That's what you should do.
Yeah.
That's what
Correct.
a good Muslim should do.
That's right, exactly. So, I think this will be a good parallel. So, before I go to the sort of these principles which I have derived, it's a part of my work which is going to be published in a monograph. Well, supposedly it should have been published by now, but somehow it got delayed due to the editing process. So I realize it's already end of December. So maybe in next few weeks it will be published, and then I'll be able to share the whole text with you. But just to give you a background of the subject of Islamic economics itself, which was introduced more formally about 100 years ago. So yes, there were like the Islamic finance instruments which was being used. There was a discussion about the banking and all that. But then, as a subject matter, Islamic economics evolved. It's a modern evolution, I would say. It's a modern evolution. Historically, there was no exclusive subject like in Islamic economics, and therefore some people believe that maybe it's also a reaction, especially what was happening in 1920s and 30s, that there was already an independence struggle from the colonization. So many Muslim lands which were part of the Ottoman Empire were then subjugated, came under different colonial controls. Before that and after that, they became independent movement. So parallel to that political struggle, Muslim thinkers, Muslim philosophers started working on developing what they termed later on as Islamic economics. And one of their fundamental points of departure had been this discussion about human behavior. And so I've referred to one leading scholar in my abstract, Nijatullah Siddiqui, who was one of the towering figures of 20th century Islamic economics, and his whole thesis, and also Chapra, another leading scholar, Umar Chapra, was that this Western capitalistic mode, or even socialism in that sense, is also Western for them, is based on this selfish desire. We talked about self-interest just a while ago. And this assumption about human being is not something which Islam, according to their understanding, would accept. So they believe that if this is the conception as Homo economicus is not acceptable by Islam, because Islam has a spiritual element and perceives human being not just as material seeking or Homo economicus, but they coined this term Homo Islamicus. So the Homo Islamicus was their ideal man, and they thought that once we construct this ideal man, we can actually redefine the struggle for wants and desires, and then we don't have to be just limited. We don't have to limit the subject of economics just to the material world. We can add a spiritual dimension to it. We can add, salvation, the human salvation to this discussion. So they made these attempts to reinterpret and reconfigure the whole subject. In their effort, many of the people in this field also then started doing, once we have this different understanding of economics or human being, then we can also create our own institutions. So there comes the subject of Islamic banks, that alternative banks as central to the financial system. Now, this is also interesting that most of the Islamic economics traditionally have considered, if you read the work, somehow their understanding of capitalism and economic system, in my view, is very limited to the financial aspect of capitalism. That is, how money is being created, what is the role of the bank, and in their text you don't see the reference to, let's say, innovation, technology, even trade. These things, these discussions, have less space, and they sort of simplify the whole capitalistic structure with how banks create money. Now, obviously, we have problems with that, and we know that various schools of economics treat this whole process of creation of money in a different way. But this variation is not present, not visible in the discussion on Islamic economics. So once they reject the idea of a human being which is selfish, then they reject the idea of let's say this interest-based economy. So for them, economy, Western economy, capitalism, interest-based, that needs to be rejected in toto. And in place, we need to have a new system of economics. So this is very fundamental to their whole thesis. And even if you read today, most of the traditional scholars in the Islamic economics held the system of economics and also the subject with some degree of contempt. There have been some criticisms on this approach within the discipline Islamic economics. So I gave a reference to in this abstract by a book which was published by 2013 titled "What is Wrong with Islamic Economics?" And this is a very good book which covers the whole sphere of theory, history, and institutions of Islamic economics. And essentially, it rejects the whole development. The Islamic economics, how it all evolved, how I have described it, it rejects the whole thing. And it says, well, at best, people who were associated with Islamic economics should have claimed that they have some teachings, they have some maybe principles, but they really, these scholars have not added anything substantial to the methodology of economics. What is the unique contribution of Islamic economics to the methodology? Very difficult to point out in this specific. And also, criticism goes to the fact that, the banks, look at the banks, it's very difficult to say that the Islamic finance is fundamentally different from conventional banks, because, for instance, the instrument of leasing for cars, for houses, is same in Islamic banks. So what happens, there is a difference of contract. So this is called, in Islamic finance terms, the housing contract is called a diminishing musharaka. Sorry for using that jargon, but diminishing musharaka means that, let's say if you have obtained lease for your house, and contracted entered in contract with an Islamic bank, this will be an ownership contract. What you are doing is you have paid something in advance, But then the money to be paid, let's say, in next 10 years and 20 years, is like units of ownership in an Islamic contract. So what happens that you pay a monthly lease according to the price agreed, and then over 10 years that ownership is reducing. It is transferring, let's say 100 units of ownership, it is transferring from bank to the user. And in 10 years time, the user becomes 100% owner. So, so there is a difference in the contract in the sense of conventional leasing, but the people who criticize Islamic economics say that this is not fundamentally different from the lease-based housing model. So really, we don't need to claim that Islam gave separate, distinctive institutions to the economic world. So now there is this I think intellectual tussle happening between the proponents of a unique, complete, Puritan version of Islamic economics to more reflective kind who are saying, oh, maybe we don't have something much to say. When I started following this subject maybe 5 or 6 years ago, 2012, 7 years ago, with a small publication on price control. So I looked at issue of price control, and I said, okay, this is a very sort of functional. This is a policy issue. Let's forget about for now. Let's forget about broad policy, broad philosophy of human behavior. Does Islam say anything about price control? And when I say Islam, so I have to mention some kind of theology. Right? So theology for Islam, of course, would mean something has to be written in Quran, or something have to be said by the Prophet Muhammad, or his practice. So that is the basis of the Islamic knowledge, right? And so I started looking for the references to these practical issues, and it turned out that not much work was done on this, like policy instruments in the economic policy. So I found no reference of prices in Quran, but then I found a very explicit reference, and more than one reference in the Prophet's history, when prices were rising in Medina, especially the food prices. It happened a few times that people came to Prophet complaining that prices have risen, and they asked in Medina. So he was already not just a prophet; he was also a ruler of the sort. Right? And so they were demanding the Prophet to fix the prices, and actually he declined. He said that I am not going to fix the prices. Prices are fixed by God. And then he gave a moral explanation to it, that why he would not like to intervene in fixing the prices. And so so my work is really sort of discovering these principles within the Islamic tradition, and then to see whether we can construct something based on these findings as a framework, not to claim as a science itself. I think I'm convinced that we cannot have a different science under the name of Islamic economics, but I am convinced that Islam does offer certain principles of economic life. Some of these principles are, I think, you can consider intuitively closer to market economy, capitalism. Some of the principles you will not find comfortable. If you are a follower of free markets, then you will not be comfortable with accepting those principles. So it's a question of faith, obviously. Then what kind of Islamic, what kind of inspiration do you draw from Islam? So, so this work is really looking at the economic life, the principles of economic life offered by Islam. And I actually bring these three principles, which I find referenced in theology, Quran, or in Hadith, the saying of Prophet, or his actions. And these really are three principles: principle of ownership, principle of wealth creation, and principle of wealth circulation. Right? And so, for instance, this is a passage from Quran. It's God who created these resources for you, and the interpretation theology is interpreted in this way that the Islamic State, the Islamic community, which the Prophet established, then was transferred to the people who followed him, and therefore there is this theological link, there is this trusteeship which the Caliph is holding to. Now obviously there was no question of democracy in that time, but there were some elements of how people were posing confidence in the ruler. This is the saying from the Prophet. He described these natural resources as belonging to a community property. And it's one of the incident in his lifetime is very interesting when he allotted a piece of land to a tribe, and this was practice, and so he for farming, and so that tribe got the rights to it. But then later on, after he allotted the piece, it was discovered that there is a salt mine under that on that piece of land. So the Prophet actually cancelled the lease and saying that this cannot be a private property anymore. This is going to be a community property. Now, obviously, there are differences in how this incident needs to be interpreted, but this is well known that he generally was in favor of having these resources as community property. I think this is. I find some similarities in what the work of Eleanor Ostrom. This is not a state property. This is not a private property, but this is how the communities were managing certain parts of these resources. But the use can be, so lease is possible, and the private property, I'll come to the private property just now. So the distinction between this natural resources and something which is created by human effort is a distinction between private property and the public property according to this framework. So something which you have developed yourself, your houses, your factories, belong to you. Now, interestingly, now the land which was the main source of like agriculture, production, all that. So there's also this I think a sort of complexity in the ownership of land. So generally it is that it is allowed that private ownership is allowed, but then there is also this ruling in Sharia that let's say if you are the owner of a piece of land, and if you're not using it, you're not cultivating it, then there is a time limit after which the state can actually cancel it and take it back. Now this is against the idea of private property, right? As we know it. So if you are owning a piece of land, you have bought it, you are not cultivating it, then it's your property. But according to this framework, then state can take it back. Some similarities can be made from housing markets. So you have a developer has bought a piece of land, right, and not developing it, not building a factory or plaza, and let it be there for price escalation. So according to our conventional understanding of free market for properties, it is absolutely legitimate because he has invested money. But land is limited. We cannot, unless seek land can be reclaimed, but in general, land is limited, supply is limited. So therefore, even the private property principle is conditioned with the use. So this is one. Second is about the transactions. I think this is important, and this is something which is conventional Islamic economics usually doesn't address much. How the wealth needs to be created, and how the human being needs to be transactions need to be governed. So the basic principle is the trade, which is sanctioned, which has a religious sanction. And as you would know that the Arabs were significant contributors to the development of the world trade. I should have said in the beginning, but maybe you know it already, that many of these prophet sayings, let's say about business. So what should be the profit, degree of profit? And so he said that no, it depends on the degree of risk you're assuming. So he didn't put a number on it, 10%, 5%. Although today we talk about price control, essentially there is a profiteering act in place in many countries, including in Malaysia, which I consider this is against the principle of Islam, because there is no number. We cannot assign a number, so it has to be given to the free market directions. And then the third principle is the principle of wealth circulation, and this is also a lot of emphasis is there in the literature. Is about so first of all, if you read the first passage, it is we who deal out to them their livelihood in this world, exalting some in rank above others, so that one may take the other into his service. And I relate it with the issue of inequality. So this is a part of the divine scheme, that inequality from a materialistic point of view also has this divine perspective, why it is there. But there's also a lot of emphasis on the distribution, on the wealth distribution, and then the rights are also defined in your wealth, and the rights are defined also in Quran, like these sort of portions from inheritance has been defined. So down from those three principles, wealth ownership, creation and circulation, we come down to some operational issues of economic policy. And I chose 8 of them here. I'm not going to go in details for everything, but I already mentioned price freedom. But then, interestingly, in Prophet's own lifetime, there's something which you are maybe aware, that Prophet himself, Prophet Muhammad, he was a very successful entrepreneur and a trader before it was revealed from God that he has a special responsibility. So actually, he was using his practical experiences as a trader and an entrepreneur in a lot of these instructions about economic policy. So for instance, I mentioned zero or low tariff. This is very interesting also. When he established his first Islamic community in the city of Medina, after Masjid, so the second institution which he established was this marketplace. And there were already 3 markets which were operated by Jews, Jewish tribes in that city, but he wanted a 4th one. And he said that there will be no taxes in my market. So obviously this was resisted, and people tried to sort of demolish that marketplace, but he persisted, and then he was able to establish this marketplace. No tariffs, so people could just come in, trade caravan would come in and do the trade. But also, interestingly, he was very particular about the inspection, the market regulations. There was an institution which he established to check the contracts, to check there is no fraudulent transactions, etc. So everything was there in the name of regulations except price control. Price control was not there. But for instance, there was a practice that the incoming so someone in the city would go out when he will receive the news. This is about 1400 years ago, right? About incoming trade caravan, and he will communicate that information, mostly exploit the information gap. Information asymmetry existed between, let's say, the residents of the city and the incoming trade one, traders, and that person, that fellow, will go out and exploit that gap. So Prophet actually stopped that practice, and he said, this is not fair for the residents because they will not be allowed to meet the traders. Not fair for the traders because they would not be able to direct communication with the with customers. So he said every trade has to happen in this physical boundary line, which is marketplace. Some people have interpreted it to criticize the role of middlemen. So if you read the modern Islamic economics, they will say, oh, middleman is un-Islamic. Actually, it happens even today. Yesterday, I was hearing a minister who was using the same thing. Like, oh, middleman is something we must curb. But it was not the middleman as such. It was the information role which the Islamic institution was trying to control. Information asymmetry. Otherwise, obviously, you cannot have trade without middlemen. Going forward, I also talk about flat taxation here, low and flat taxation. So the principle of zakat is essentially a fiscal responsibility. It ranges from 2.5% to 20%, depends on the source of your wealth. There's a whole list which has been developed, and the principle is that this is the tax which everyone who can pay will pay, but it is a flat. It is not. It does not. The rate doesn't change as your income grows. There is no reference in Islamic theology about currency. There is no clear reference, but there is a discussion whether the gold currency is Islamic or not. It's a gray area. But given some parameters of gold currency, which is especially about stability, and the fact that it could be, the exploitation can be limited, there is a preference in some circles. I ascribe to it for gold-backed currency. Waqf is an institution of social nature. You might be surprised to know that Waqf was essentially, what was Waqf? It was a private property which was meant for a social cause, right? But what is surprising that it was not just a principle. It actually, Muslims were practicing it. So as late as 19th century Ottoman Empire era, in the areas under Ottoman Empire, 2/3 or maybe 70% also, some people relate, of the land was under some kind of waqf. So what was that doing? That was like people's property dedicated for some social causes. Can be education, can be welfare of family. So there was significant role played by these institutions. So essentially the role of the state, if you think that the taxes are low and the private property is strong, is limited in this framework. But there's also a very strong inheritance law which is defined, although the state cannot become one of the inheritors, so there cannot be any inheritance tax in Islam from this point of view. So, okay, I think I've spoken more than my allotted time, and I've explained all these points here. I'm happy to share the presentation with you. But essentially, my last point really is that what I read is that these principles also following an understanding of morality and justice. So it is derived from direct religious instructions. So whether it is in Quran or in the Prophet's practice. So therefore, there is a degree of Islamic legitimacy, if you like. But we should not expand this framework into maybe like a whole discipline. We cannot substitute the discipline of Islamic of economic. Maybe we can consider this as one way of looking at how economic life needs to be organized. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Ali. I really care that you, in this presentation, I push on you to do it.